Tillbaka. Oops, sorry. Okay, so that's actually what we're doing as humans to the planet. Obviously, we're toying around with it.
Mm-hmm. And it's going to survive, but we as humans are more likely to suffer. And that's why we need to get serious about shifting to a sustainable trajectory, and we need to do it now, basically.
Yes, and we agree as scientists with the business community that what gets measured gets done.
Yeah. So should we start?
We should start.
Yeah, we should start. I need my
Absolutely.
speaker cards.
Yeah, and me too.
Yeah.
So this is Lisen Schultz. She's the Director of Education at the Stockholm Resilience Centre.
And this is Beatrice Crona, who is the Scientific Director at the Stockholm Resilience Centre.
And Per Olsson, you're the Deputy Science Director of the Stockholm Resilience Centre. And what we will do today here is to bring you to the forefront of sustainability science and show you the pivotal role that investors and companies, like the ones you represent, play in an emerging risk landscape. You're both exposed to it and you're shaping it. And we hope that the coming 45 minutes will help you discover your true impact on the planet as a whole, open your minds to transformations, and find your ways of becoming stewards of this planet that we all depend on. So in other words, how to start doing business within planetary boundaries. And I'm going to thank you, Per, now. You're going to come back soon, so you can just have a seat over there.
Yeah, and I wanted to start by asking you, how many of you have a timepiece or have looked at that timepiece, looked at your phone in the last half hour to kind of, check what time it is, know where you're supposed to be, that you're supposed to be here, for example. And and did you know that the first, basically, device to keep track of time is over 5,000 years old? And keeping track of time has been instrumental for how we organize our lives, organize our societies, right? And there's a not too distant a parallel between thinking about organizing and running a sustainable business, because you need some kind of device of keeping track of where you are, your impact, where you're going, and if you're heading towards that place that we all want to be.
And that's what you're going to talk about very soon. But first, we just want to go straight into what we meant with this statement that we're toying with the planet and getting us a situation check, basically, a diagnostic. And some scientists, including Johan Rockström, who founded the Stockholm Resilience Centre back in the days, say that this is actually the only graph one needs to know about to understand the urgency of the situation that we're facing as humanity on planet Earth. It shows the change of mean annual temperature on planet Earth going all the way back 400,000 years back. So back then, we appeared as humans maybe 200,000 years ago. We were nomadic. We were very few on the planet. We traveled around following ice ages back and forth, not having a very big impact, obviously, on the global level. Then we enter into the last, we come out of the last ice age and we come into this glacial, geological epoch called the Holocene, which is characterized by a very stable climate. And that's what you see in the middle here. Actually, during the Holocene, when the climate stabilized, it only has shifted 0.5 degrees back up and down. And that's what we now call the corridor of life, or at least the corridor of human life, because this is where our civilizations appeared, our agriculture, our cities, impact investments, all of the things that we do today and care about and depend upon. And then you can see towards the end here where we start burning fossil fuels, start deforesting and so on, so that we now are approaching more than 3 degrees warming was the latest report saying towards the end of the century. So that's a kind of temperature that the planet hasn't experienced in several million years. And for sure, we as humanity and our civilizations have not experienced anything near this. So this is what we need to avoid. And another way to define that corridor of life that we all need to stay within. And of course, this picture, of course, shows, you already saw it this morning, the devastating impacts that we already see today from the 1.2 degree warming that we have experienced. A picture from very nearby here. But defining then the corridor of life is what the Planetary Boundaries Framework does. It was also developed by Johan Rockström and almost 30 Earth system scientists across the world who came together and tried to figure out what are the core pressures that we put on the planet as humanity. And what is the safe operating space for us within which we can actually develop, thrive, and have companies and investments and economies and well-being. And that's defined by this green here, the safe operating space. And as you can see, it's not only about the climate and the carbon emissions that we see here up here. We actually see also the loss of biodiversity as a core pressure, the way we change ecosystems and turn them into agriculture, for example, so land system change, the way we change our freshwater flows on the planet, the way we leak nutrients from agriculture into the waters. And all of those boundaries have been transgressed already, so we're in a high-risk landscape and need to come back into the safe operating space. And then there are 3 more boundaries here. Ocean acidification, which comes from the greenhouse gases that are dissolved in the ocean. The atmospheric aerosol loading, so that's air pollution basically, and then the ozone layer that we all know that we've started to actually heal now thanks to the agreements to ban CFCs. And then the final boundary up there is novel entities, so that's all the chemicals we produce like plastics that start affecting the biosphere. So what this means then is that our activities as humans are now changing the whole operation of the planet. It's bouncing us out of the stable climate, this corridor of human life that we've been, the Holocene. And this also in turn means that we need to now become stewards of the planet that we depend on. And that's this concept of biosphere stewardship. Biosphere is this thin layer of life around the planet that we all depend on and that we're part of. And in the last 6 years, we have educated CEOs and investors and owners of really large companies around the planetary boundaries and what it takes to become a corporate biosphere steward. We've also worked a lot with union leaders to help them find their role in this shift, and we've worked with entrepreneurs and investors to help them. And what you will get here now in the coming 40 minutes or so is a very condensed version of those key messages. We've also developed a report that we launch today in order to support the private sector at large and you all in this shift towards biosphere stewardship. Because of course a key part is what Bea started saying, being able to measure to what extent are we actually moving towards biosphere stewardship, what is our true impact on the planet. And what is it that we need in order to be able to quantify the aggregate impact on these planetary boundaries? What's actually material for the planet? Because if we cannot do that, it's like flying a plane without instruments or trying to be on time without a watch. So Bea, I'm going to turn to you now.
Give me the clicker.
How do you actually measure the pressure that we're putting on the planet?
Well, it's by capturing environmental pressures or impacts from economic activities on a whole range of environmental dimensions that go beyond just carbon and are basically embodied or captured by these 9 boundaries that you've been talking about, right?
Sounds easy, but how do you actually do it in practice?
Well, I'd say it boils down to measuring what matters, and I guess we'll try and unpack that for you in the next 15 minutes or so. But yeah, this report that is trying to provide some what I call like nuggets of knowledge that you need to have with you and that fit together, kind of like a piece of the puzzle to understand as a business, what is it I can do? How can I think about measuring what matters? What is it that I have to disclose above and beyond sometimes perhaps what's mandated? And all of those things that can help us kind of hit the targets for a livable planet.
So where do you suggest that we start then?
So we need to start, we like to talk about this in sort of 3 steps. I'm not going to say they're simple because they might not be simple, but there's sort of 3 steps. And the first point to think about and remember is that location matters. Like where something happens really matters. We can use the notion of carbon emissions as an interesting way to illustrate and contrast that. Because a carbon atom, whether it was released this morning when you took a taxi to this venue here in Barcelona or when I stepped on the airplane late last night in Frankfurt, that carbon atom is going to go into the atmosphere and have the same effect on warming, basically. But if you think of pretty much any other environmental concern, things that we care about, whether it's water use, land use, impacts on biodiversity and ecosystems, it all matters where that happens, right? So you extract 10,000 cubic meters of water in a place like Barcelona. It's going to have a different effect than if you do the same thing to like in Stockholm, where I live.
Where we have a lot of water.
Where we have a lot of water. So where? That's really where economic activities take place. That is a fundamental first piece of this puzzle that we're going to lay now.
Where?
Yeah.
Everyone follows.
Where?
So what's next?
Next, I'm sorry. Where next is what? So what is really just about, what economic activity is happening in a particular place. And it might seem obvious, but it's not necessarily. We're not really reporting that way in the corporate space right now. We're not really reporting by asset. But just knowing what is happening is fundamental. So again, let's take a thing like, irrigated agriculture, just because it's a simple and a straightforward example. So if we're doing that irrigated agriculture in a place that has a lot of water, and we know that irrigated agriculture uses a lot of water, it's in the name, it's not going to matter so much, perhaps, in one part of the world. But again, if you're doing that same thing in an arid peninsula like here, it's going to matter. So that's why where and what together are fundamental to understand the severity of a particular impact.
And then the piece of how much.
The how much. Yeah, so the how much, that's really just about quantifying the impact, right? And I don't actually know who's in the audience, but I imagine that many of you have been in the corporate space on and off at least for a while, and you know that as corporates, you've been measuring carbon emissions for years now, so that's not new to you. And if you've been operating in jurisdictions that have more stringent regulations, you'll be well aware that, like in Sweden, for example, you already have to report certain quantitative measures. So, for example, how much water you're using and retaining and then releasing back into the environment. So it's not new. But what's really important and what this report tries to do is to flag that how we're used to conveying environmental impact, it often comes in two flavors, a relative and an absolute.
Can you explain a bit more about the difference between those?
So, what I mean by that is very often today, a fair amount of the environmental pressures or impacts that are disclosed by companies comes in the form of intensity measures. So you've heard of carbon intensity, right? Which is basically just taking your carbon footprint or your carbon emissions and dividing it by like production volumes, like kilowatt hours of energy produced, or by your revenues. And when you do that, you're normalizing. You're basically making it so that you can compare across companies and sectors regardless of the size of the company. So it's a really smart thing to do, and it's an important thing to do. But we also have to realize that when you do that, you can end up in a situation where you're looking at a company with a relatively, so this is where these measures are relative, with a relatively lower carbon intensity, for example. But that company is also growing year on year. And as it does so, it might still have a low relative emission, right? But the absolute impact of that company, nonetheless, is a growing carbon footprint. And so we just need to keep both of these things in our head at the same time and recognize that while relative measures are super important, in the end, it's the aggregate measures of the absolute values that are going to determine whether we are staying within this safe space, or as it is now, we're already beyond it for several of these, whether we're going to be able to go back and move into that safe space. And so therefore, relative measures, super important, but we can't rely on those alone when we're operating in the world with absolute boundaries.
Because the planet doesn't really care about the relative measures, it cares about the actual absolute.
Yeah, I mean, we can end up in 2030, 2040, 2050 with an economy which has vastly more efficient companies, right? But if in aggregate, the impacts of all of that, of our economies, is still beyond the boundaries, we're still going to have some real problems because it's risky to be out here in that orange space.
So I hear, from the CEOs that I meet that there's a lot of things happening in the space now of non-financial reporting and a lot of regulations coming into place, and it's almost overwhelming, all of these frameworks and so on. So what you're suggesting here is that another thing then for companies to keep track of and another type of work, or is it sort of included in those frameworks somehow?
It is included, and I just want to say first that it is really exciting to see that we're having this movement in the kind of governance space as well, in the space of non-financial reporting. And but, and I'm going to talk about 2 buts that I want to flag and that flags in this report, is that there's so much reporting requirements being put on companies now. I don't know how many of you are in companies that are large enough that you have to report, but there is a lot. And so in that space, then you could say, like, well, these how much questions, what I was saying were really important, are they in there? And they are. But there's so many. There's the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. There's the Global Reporting Initiative. There's the European ones that are coming into effect now, the European Sustainability Reporting Standards that are basically mandatory for larger companies. And just the environmental disclosures in the European ones is in excess of 800 data points. And I think it's really difficult to know what to prioritize there. So that's why, that's the one but, that it's exciting to see this. There's a lot happening here, but it's also quite overwhelming. And the other thing is that, let's face it, these systems that are now moving towards including, environmental things, they're still a bit stuck in a company-centric perspective. And so as companies, you're still going to be asked to look first and foremost at what's material to you. And then when you've defined that, you can say, what's the environmental impact of that? So basically, what are the financially material environmental impacts of your business? And it's understandable that we're doing it that way, but you are going to probably miss some things that may not appear to you in the immediate, but are material to the planet. So.
But then is there a guidance maybe around how to prioritize? Because I also know that companies who do want to do things right, they don't know what of those 800 variables should I use and why? What's my rationale for that?
Yeah.
Is that something you can help with maybe, Bea? Yeah.
Yeah, so funny you should ask. Because basically, yes, we think we're scientists, but we think that science has a big role here to play, to help in this particular regard, to help prioritize. And we've developed something that is called essential environmental impact variables. It's really long, it's really cumbersome, and it's really nerdy and scientific. I apologize. But it has there's a reason behind it. Because how many of you in here put up your hand if you think that it's totally obvious and necessary that we report on carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions to know where we are in relation to climate change? Yeah, so that's most of you. That's good. I would be worried otherwise. But do you know why? Why are we reporting on carbon emissions for that? It's because greenhouse gas emissions is what's called an essential variable. Right? It's an essential climate variable. It's a piece of information that is considered essential for being able to say something meaningful about the status of a particular facet of the Earth system, so the climate, for example. Right? And so, yeah, that's the main reason why we're reporting on that. And we're saying we've developed something that is very similar in logic, that is basically capturing the most essential environmental impact that of companies, but in a standardized manner. So it isn't just up to subjective decisions by individual companies on what seems important or not.
And it's based on the planetary boundaries then, these variables?
Yes, exactly. So that it's based in the science of the planetary boundaries. So basically, if you're using this as a means to prioritize what to focus on, what to measure within your company, and what to keep track of as you're growing, for example, as a startup, then yes, you are basically capturing the 9 planetary boundaries.
And then you can show how this company is contributing to either kicking us out of the Holocene or helping us remain within the Holocene.
Exactly.
Nice. So then, just to be clear, these essential environmental impact variables, are they then captured in these existing frameworks that I asked about before and standards, or is it another thing that the companies need to report on?
No. So that's the key thing here. It's not another framework to understand or to not. It's actually, we're just saying it's a prioritization help, right? Because these how much questions, the essential variables, they're already strewn in amongst these hundreds and hundreds of reporting requirements. But if you say, I'm serious about understanding what's material to the planet, this can help you sift through and say that at least I want to keep track of these things.
Okay. But then I want to come back also to this issue that you've kept talking about during this conversation around the relative and the absolute. Again, why is it so important that you just don't stay with the relative measures?
Yeah. So I think basically what I want to say here is just that if we agree, and I think most people, at least in this room, do, that we want to stay within these boundaries or stay in that green safe space, or, as is the case for 6 of these now, try to come back within that space. If that's what we want to do, then what is material to the planet or to the environment has to be what guides environmental impact disclosures and what we keep track of and try to measure, right? Not what seems most financially material and important at this particular time for individual companies. And but so the important point that I'm trying to make here is really that planetary boundaries are not going to be transgressed by those financially material impacts alone. They are going to be transgressed by the gradual accumulation of like millions of small impacts that we're all adding, right? And that are added by all the economic actors, all of our activities, basically, even if they seem minute or small to your particular operations. It's the adding up of those that is slowly, or not so slowly sometimes, pushing us across these boundaries or preventing us from coming back into it. So when it comes to nature and when it comes to planetary boundaries, every little bit of impact actually counts.
And your dream sounds to be like that every company, every asset owner, every investor would actually report at least on these essential environmental impact variables so that we could be able to keep track on the aggregate impact. But then once you have all of that data then as an investor, what do you do to understand the impact then?
Well, now you said as an investor, I think it goes as a company or as an investor. We'll talk of that in a minute. But basically, if you're armed with that information that we started this conversation with, which is like the where, the what, and the how much, which sounds very simple when you say it like that. I know it's not as simple as to always get that information. But anyway, if you have that, suddenly a whole unprecedented range of analytical possibilities opens up for you as well to try and understand what is my actual impact at different scales in terms of different types of impact, biodiversity, climate, and it opens up a lot more opportunity for accuracy and also assessing your own risks.
And do you have a framework for that?
Yes. So, I mean, well, we have developed we've developed a tool that it's like, I don't want to just push this tool, but it is our tool. But there are many others that are become available when this kind of data can be plugged in. And some of them that are available on the market now, like biodiversity footprinting tools that many of you may have seen or been aware of. The way they're being used right now, they're not particularly informative. And that's because the data they're being plugged into them is like revenue data and this kind of thing. It doesn't tell you very much. But armed with this data, they would say a whole lot more and suddenly be quite informative. But this tool here is something we've developed called the Earth System Impact Score. And it's, what it's unique about this is that it basically captures carbon, water, and land. So 3 of these planetary boundaries all in one tool. And on top of that, it basically tries to capture the amplified effects of the interactions between those. So I'm going to be nerdy and scientific and just dwell for a minute on those interactions because I'm not sure it's very clear what I mean. But basically, climate change, if you look at that right-hand figure there, what does it do? Well, it changes weather patterns, right? So it'll change how much rain you get in a particular area or not, for example, droughts, floods. And that fundamentally affects how much water is available, both in our rivers and lakes and in our groundwater. And then similarly, rain and temperatures are going to affect what grows in a particular place and how much, right? And I don't know how many of you know about carbon cycles and things in here, but basically what grows in a place is fundamental to determining how much carbon gets stored and captured in that vegetation, right? Resulting in how much is, not released into the atmosphere, thus helping us to bring the temperatures down. So those are the kinds of interactions that this tool, I think, is unique in actually capturing. And by doing that, it gives you sort of a systemic understanding or a systemic footprint at the Earth system scale of your local business activities.
So how do you suggest that this is used then for different groups?
So at the moment we're testing it with a few different types of actors, and so far what we think that this can be used is for companies. It's basically, trying to using the score to understand if we think of your assets, all your different production sites or whatever, which ones have the biggest Earth system impact, and also being able to disaggregate, not just saying like the total impact, but actually seeing, is it water, is it land use, or is it carbon that's the most problematic in a particular region that I'm operating in. And for institutional investors, particularly like, for example, lending institutions, we can think of using it very much in the same way as I just said for companies, but here in order to support your investee companies, your portfolio companies, or pushing them or supporting them, but also to actually start to assess impacts before and after. So thinking about it as a way to also pre and post issuance of bonds, for example, or project. So I can see it being used here in impact investing. And finally, and perhaps more useful to this crowd is, for venture capital investors and your founders. Like, we've been really fortunate to work and test this and bounce around ideas with VC 2050. And they've been trying to say to us, this is how we think we could maybe use this for our portfolio companies. So pre-screening, use it as a pre-screening tool to see like where are going to be regions of least impact if we develop our sites here versus here. But also, as a means to start to think about scenarios. As I'm growing and I'm sourcing from different places, if I source from here and here, I'm likely to have a bigger impact than if I can try and secure suppliers from different regions, for example. So I think I'm going to finish there by just like pitching a little bit. So if you're interested in finding out more about that tool, me and two of my colleagues are going to be workshopping tomorrow at 10:40 in the Beach Lounge. And if you're interested in any of the other nuggets of information and knowledge that I talked about, then you're welcome to look at the report. But we're going to get a QR code later, I think.
Yes, by the end of this session.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Bea.
Thank you.
Yeah, big hand for you. So that's quite technical, but yet I think a fundamental shift in how we view the things we actually look at in order to understand our impact. But I also said in the intro here that we're going to talk about larger transformations and the shifts that actually are required and need to happen for a tool like this to really take off and scale. And so to talk about that, we have Per Olsson, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. And so in the report we have a section that talks about that these measurement tools, etc., has to come with or be accompanied by a larger scale change. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that, because we know that in order to stay within the planetary boundaries, we have to achieve large scale, rapid, and deep transformations. And that includes the behaviors, our practices, rules and regulations, deeper values and mindsets and worldviews. And then also we talk about also that it needs to be a fundamental shift in resource flows, how capital flows, how and also who is deciding what and how, the power issues, how we allocate power in society. So there's basically a systems change that has to happen, and changing the system that created the problems in the first place. So that's what we mean by transformation. And transformation, when we look at transformation also at the center, we also talk about a fundamental shift in our relationship to the planet that needs to happen, and that we heard of here. There is two dimensions that you need to work in simultaneously when you work with transformative change. So that's, I forgot to say that. So it's about, like, the whole thing about transformation is basically changing the way we change the world. So I'm going to talk a bit about that. But you can't see the fine text here in this picture, but I want you to keep an eye on the colors and also the shape of these curves. And we need to work both in these dimensions. So the green curve is about the dimension that has to do with new ideas, innovation, scaling, and impact. But we also have to work along the red line, right? So that's about letting go of what's not working. So unlearning, letting go, etc. Because if too much of the status quo, the red system part is there, it's gonna hamper the green line. So potentially disruptive ideas that you might have becomes adaptive, because there is a big chance that the system is changing you more than you are changing the system. So there's the whole co-optation process happening there. And so we need capacities to work in these two dimensions. So I think that here, John Vasconcellos, who was a senator in California, I think he framed these capacities in a really sort of nice and poetic way, where he talks about that we both have to be midwives to give birth to the new innovation, the new ideas, but at the same time we have to be hospice workers to work with what needs to go, with stewarding loss and let things die, but die with dignity. So, because right now, there's a huge mobilization, and you feel it in this house, huge mobilization for transformative change among a lot of actors in society and around the world. But at the same time, there's a counter-mobilization. There's something happening right now, which is increased political polarization, increased violent conflict, and democratic backsliding. Right when we need to make the big step, this is hitting us. And so we talk about, in our research, we try to look at this sort of resistance and transformation backlash that happens in moments when often then we need to institutionalize, we have to change our rule systems, the values, etc. And some has to do, I think, with what people talk about as transition risk and transition pain. So there's the transition pain has to do with the emotional dimension of transformative change, where a lot of people, for example, working in the fossil fuel economy, is going to feel like losers when we change those systems towards, for example, renewables. So I can stand here and say, like, win-win, we all win if we do these transformations, but people feel like losers. And they have feelings of grief, of losing their identity, fear of losing income, and these unattended feelings can easily become anger. Anger turns to hate. Hate turns into threats, and we see that in society. And there's a lot of studies that looks at where, for example, a lot of men working in the fossil fuel economy, where do they go with their unattended feelings, in how they vote, how do they behave on social media, etc. And it seems to be fueling and contributing or provide a fertile soil for populism, for example, and also for this dehumanization, this polarization, dehumanization, demonization of the people who doesn't think like you. So that's a very, very sort of concerning trend right now. And sometimes this also has to do then feeling threatened by the undoing, the red curve. If it's an authoritarian regime or a dictator, they can, of course, start wars, and which sort of contribute to the sort of the global instability at the moment. Another dimension then that has to do with more of the green curve is that what are the effects of all the good things that we put out there to solve the climate change crisis, for example, all the technology. For example, if we are very, very successful in Sweden in the green transition, how did that affect other countries? And in the report we did with SIDA and 30 companies in Sweden, we looked at what are the potential negative effects of those innovations in low and middle income countries. So, for example, we have talked about, and Olivia Lazard last year at the Impact Week, she talked about the critical minerals, for example, and that we need for the green transition, and what sort of, how does that look out in the world when it comes to mining and human rights, etc., and local conflicts. So And there's a lot of indigenous advocates around the world that talks about the black transition instead of the green transition, because they talk about how it will affect them negatively. So we have to have this, when we think about investment and navigating what impact it has, we have to think about these things, and we have to think about inclusion. And some indigenous advocates also talk about that we don't just want to be included in what someone else have come up with. We want to feel like we belong. So that's also, I think, a interesting concept to use, the feeling of belonging in these contexts. So this puts a lot, what I talk now, it puts a lot of focus on justice and equality and equity, and which is missing in the ESI than what we talked about before, also in the planetary boundary. So it's something that we have to add to this equation, and that we have to continue to explore. And so we have the high uncertainty right when we need to do the big transition, high uncertainty, but also this issue of inclusion that we have to address. And I just want to show this book addressing a lot of these issues, a new book just now in September by a friend and colleague, Ian Scoons. He has a lot of examples of sort of how we have dealt with uncertainty and navigating these uncertainties in different cases, and also addressing the justice issues. So what we need then, we need new frameworks for actions. So if solutions create problems, we need frameworks for action to launch our solutions in a broader context, keep track of the planetary boundaries, but also justice issues. We have new frameworks that helps us deal with uncertainty and turbulence, that can help us deal with the challenges of unmaking and making. And I thought about I want to change the sign outside on the building, like be part of the solutions, like be part of a new frameworks for action that might help deal with some of the problems. But it's too long, right? It doesn't hit you the same way. But also there are really promising principle-based or focused evaluation that are tools that works well when you have high uncertainty, but also high agency. So you have the ability to do stuff, but your world is very uncertain. You don't know exactly where things are going to end up. So you need to keep track of unintended or maybe unexpected positive outcomes, but also unexpected negative outcomes, of course. So if we do this, we might then be able to achieve the large-scale, rapid and deep transformations that I mentioned earlier. And in the process then, let the planet heal itself and us, and also help us to thrive within the planetary boundaries. And as I said before, the important part here, and what we need to navigate and understand, is the how of transformative change. So that is something we do research on, but I think it's absolutely crucial that we explore that together. So that's why we're going to talk about a bit more that planetary mindset tomorrow in the beach lounge at 1:10 tomorrow up here. And I also want to mention then that in this exploration of the stewardship, the transformative change, and tools for measuring, etc., all that experimentation and exploring, we need to do together. I'm really happy then that we have the opportunity to do this now with Norrsken, and this report that we talked about here is that sort of first step of tightening. We've been working a long time together, but right now we're focusing in on and tightening it around these issues, and it's really fantastic to do that. And if you want to join, please come and talk to us, because we need more people in those collaborations. Yeah.
Thank you, Per.
Yep. Thank you.
And I think that wraps up the session.
Yep.
The report you can find here with this QR code, but we would also love for you to come join us. We will now go up to that.
You're in the camera.
The green room.
Oh,
Hey,
the speakers, corner,
Okay.
or
No.
it's called something else, but a few up here will be there. You can come join us there right now to talk more, but also in the workshops. Say again, where are the workshops and when? Yours is 1:10
tomorrow
Beach
in the
Lounge.
beach lounge,
Yeah.
which I think is right up there.
Yeah, and Beatrice,
We're also in the beach lounge, but at 10:40.
focusing on Earth system impact
System impact.
and planetary mindset.
Yep.
Yes. Okay, fantastic. Thanks for the attention.
Thanks.
Thank you.